NATO has just revealed a momentous reshuffle of its top military commands. The US is stepping out of operational leads and leaving those to Europe. Instead, Washington's chosen to go all in on theatre component commands. For the UK, it means handing Maritime Command at Northwood to an American admiral, but a British general will take over the Joint Force Command in Norfolk, Virginia, the only NATO base on US soil. A former deputy commander of JFC Norfolk is with us to explain exactly what military capability that general will lead and how they might be called on to use it, as well as what difference, if any, this will actually make. Then there is the big picture. Is this an American pullback from NATO in action, or merely a sensible military realignment reflecting reality? Mike and I will talk to a former top official of the alliance. And who would want that new top military job in Norfolk? As the Chief of Defence Staff concedes many see a NATO posting as a career roadblock.
Working hard to ensure that those who have got that experience have opportunities to promote.
You picked it up as an issue.
100%.
Defence Explained.
Only a year ago, Pete Hegseth was here saying, hey guys, you have to do more here in Europe. And look what happened. Europe is now taking the commands which will really do the actual war fighting.
This is Sitrep with James Hirst and Professor Michael Clarke.
Exactly a year ago, Mike, you were sat here and you told us that NATO had taken a body blow, possibly the biggest in its history, after a tirade from Pete Hegseth telling Europe it had to stand on its own 2 feet, and also in there the demand for Ukraine to do a peace deal. I wonder if this reshuffle, is it militarily significant? Is it organisationally significant? Is it, as I said, a momentous reshuffle, or does it just look like that?
No, I think there's something real in it, certainly, because it's sensible in lots of ways. And it does reflect the fact that the NATO allies understand that they've got to step up, and everybody agrees with that. I mean, I think the point about NATO's crisis, as it were, is that nobody disagrees that they were on a glide path to stepping up, and the Trump administration has made that a cliff edge, either step up or go out of business. And so that's a good thing, no question about that. But the problem is, underlying that is this doubt about the transatlantic relationship, whether the United States really is backing NATO up. And so this reorganization of commands, in one sense, as it were, cements the United States into the theatre level, the tactical and theatre level operations, and makes the Europeans step up to the big operational level. So that's sensible, but there are elements in it which, if the political scenario is unfavourable, that could be a problem. But it really all depends on the political scenario. I guess we'll talk about that in a while.
OK, well, let me just run through the reshuffle in full so everybody knows exactly where the cards lie. Joint Force Command Norfolk in Virginia, that is handed by the US to the UK. Joint Force Command Naples is handed by the US to Italy. Joint Force Command Branson, that will now rotate between a German and Polish lead. That has long been European-led. The US retains Air Command in Ramstein, Land Command in Izmir, and now takes over Maritime Command at Northwood. As I said, Mike, that this is the Americans taking the component commands and leaving, as you said, the joint force commands to the Europeans. Can you just explain the difference between those and their role, the component of the joint force?
Yeah, well, in theory, in outline, the joint force commands are the operational level. So theirs is the job of integrating, planning for operations. Obviously, if NATO goes into battle somewhere, or if NATO goes into operations, it will be a joint operation, air, land and sea, probably the sea, but it'll be joint, and lots of other things that go with it. There's stratcoms and the intelligence and all the rest of it. So the joint forces commands are the commands that have got to plan for all the enablers and all the forces to go and do an operation. So those are, critical commands. And then beneath them, the component commands are the tactical. So the single domain, an air command, a land command, a sea command. And so they then give the forces, or they create the forces that are then given or used by the Joint Forces Command. So the component commands are below the Joint Forces Commands. But of course, they're very, very important because it means that the commander as it were, is responsible for all of the naval assets, all of the air assets, all of the land assets that are then available up the chain to the Joint Forces Command that plans the integrated operation. So that's what it looks like in theory.
So when I saw this story a couple of days ago, I looked at it, and being a typical journalist, I wanted to go, hang on, is the UK a winner or a loser here? Because I wonder how this is going to be going down with the armed forces. Maritime Command in Northwood going to America, and that might feel like a blow to the Royal Navy. But equally, taking on Norfolk, Virginia, that's a very high profile command on US soil.
Yes, it is. So in a way, you'd say that the overall effect is neutral, but there's no doubt about it that, Northwood is a very capable headquarters, and it's been a major, one of the major NATO headquarters, and it's been commanded by a Brit. The idea that there won't be a Brit in command of that, I think, has to reflect not just the tidiness of these new arrangements, and they are tidier than they were before, but it does reflect the fact that the Royal Navy, can't put enough ships to sea. That's the state that it's in. With all due respect to Gwyn Jenkins, the First Sea Lord, he knows the Navy is close to the edge of being not capable of its basic tasks. It hasn't tipped over the edge yet, but it admits it's close to the edge. So it is a blow. On the other hand, it's a one-for-one trade, and the new arrangement, as and when it becomes reality, it'll take some time to bed in, is a tidier arrangement in military terms.
Well, let's get some thoughts on this from two people with very deep and very different experiences inside NATO. We welcome back Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Threats. Jamie is in Brussels this morning.
Hi there.
Good to see you again. And we have retired Rear Admiral Tim Henry, who was Deputy Commander at JFC Norfolk in Virginia from 2021 to 2024. Hello, Tim. Welcome to Sitrep.
Good morning. Thank you.
First of all, what do you both make of this shake-up? Tim, I'd be surprised when you saw it?
No, not surprised. It's been a conversation for a while. So for anyone to think that this is sort of lastminute.com kind of change would be wrong. I mean, JFC Norfolk's only about 4 or 5 years old now as a command. And when it started, it was not fully blown Joint Force Command. It had the title of Joint Force Command, but its standing and roles were much, much tighter. I think very quickly everyone realized that where we've gone with our adversaries, that wasn't fit for purpose. So JFC Norfolk has grown. It's grown fourfold in the last 2 or 3 years. And it's gone from having a 3-star US commander with a 2-star deputy to now a 3-star US commander and a 3-star British deputy. And will soon go from a 3-star US commander to a 4-star UK commander. And that growth over 3 years is a statement of the perception of the UK within the High North and the Atlantic, I would suggest, and also the importance of that command. I'd also say it doesn't have to be a general. So any general, admiral or air marshal, it's a joint force command, and any of the services, Royal Marine, any of the services can command it, and it should be the best person to command it. And there's a lot of water there. Of course there is. The Atlantic is a big body of water, and the Arctic Ocean is firmly within that geographic remit as well. But there's a complicated land fight, if ever we had to fight, in the High North. And there is also the complex air integration challenge. So true jointery, in a way that, of the 3 JFCs, Norfolk stands out with the maritime, but has a major joint component.
We'll talk a bit more about JFC Norfolk in a moment. Jamie, I want your thoughts, though, from someone who spent a long time in NATO headquarters, probably witnessed lots of conversations about things like this before. What did you think when you heard about this reshuffle?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised, even if I didn't have the details in advance, no longer being sort of on the inside of NATO. But clearly, we've heard from Pete Hegseth, he was mentioned at the beginning, this push towards Europe taking on more responsibility, Pentagon wanting the European NATO to be able to assure its own conventional defence by 2030, although that's unrealistic, but that push is there. And frankly, to my mind, reshuffling posts in the command structure is better than seeing, lots of American captains and colonels quit the NATO command structure because leaders have to have staff and headquarters have to be properly staffed. And it's that sort of deep embedding of American planners at senior level in these commands, organizing exercises, linking what's going on in the United States to Europe, which really matters. And there have been, just before this a command structure reshuffle, there were some announcements of some American withdrawals from the command structure. Not massive, not in a way which would eviscerate it, but for example, from the Joint Intelligence Fusion Center at Molesworth, a large number of American intelligence officers departing. And so, to my mind, that is really what would hurt NATO. Now, more specifically, first of all, looking at Joint Forces Command Naples, Mike will, I hope, bear me out when I say this, but, a NATO long-timer, that made me smile because Mike will remember in the 90s that President Chirac of France asked for the Americans to transfer to a European the command in Naples as a sort of quid pro quo for France reintegrating NATO's command structure. And that produced a massive argument at the time. And this was the Clinton administration said no. And the Americans made it clear that they would, over their dead body, would they ever surrender this command. And now, a couple of decades later, they do it. Italy takes over and nobody bats an eyelid. So first of all, how times have changed in that respect. Secondly, on Brunson, the Joint Forces Command, that makes sense. I mean, Poland is a big contributor to NATO. Its defense budget this year is 4.8% of GDP. Germany and Poland are, of course, the backbone of NATO's future land conventional defense of Europe. Germany is stepping up as well. And these two countries have not always had the easiest security relationship, particularly under the previous Polish government. So it makes sense, I think, for those two countries to be working together now on a rotational basis. It will force them to work together. And again, it's significant that, a new member state of NATO, although it's not really new any longer since 1999, but I welcome that. On what we've been talking about, finally, which is, of course, Norfolk. Well, first of all, don't forget that the Europeans have a big footprint already in the United States because JFC Norfolk is co-located, of course, with Allied Command Transformation, traditionally under a French admiral, which it is, of course, today, with a British admiral being the chief of staff there. So there is that. So it strengthens the European footprint, which I suppose is a good thing. But what makes me sort of smile a little bit, if I can be my usual candid self.
Please do.
Is that we've had a big thing in the last couple of weeks and months about Greenland, and only the United States could defend Greenland, and that's why the United States had to own it, that the Europeans could not do it, only the Americans. And what we see is that we have this announcement on Norfolk in the same week that NATO, yesterday in Brussels, launched its new Arctic Sentry mission. The Brits have to play a big role in that. Mike was referring to this in the maritime domain. The British have to organise a big exercise in the Arctic with the Joint Expeditionary Force in September. The UK has pledged 2,000 troops to Norway, also with the cold response exercise going on. So the UK is now taking on a big role here, together with Denmark and the Europeans. But at the same time, of course, as the UK is leading the coalition of the willing to put forces on the ground in Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, which we can't exclude altogether in 2026. So it's quite strange that the defence of the High North, which was meant to be an American responsibility, is being really handed over now to the Europeans. And I think for the UK, it's great to have this leading role. But yes, we'll come to this. Are the capabilities really going to be there? To do Eastern Europe, to do Ukraine, to do Norway, to do everything else. I suppose it will accelerate the discussion in the UK about the defence investment plan, right? Over and out.
Mike and Tim, I saw you both smiling there, but Mike several times particularly. I mean, Jamie was bringing up a lot of ironies there, wasn't he?
Yes, politics moves in strange ways, and we shouldn't expect, great consistency. But I'm quite hopeful in a way that this reorganisation will be good for NATO if we can avoid the crises that might, as it were, surround it. And I do think NATO is in deep political trouble for all the reasons that we've talked about before. But NATO is shaking itself down into a better-looking organisation. If it's going to be an organisation of 32, with the Europeans taking much more of the burden of operations and of impetus for NATO, then shaking it down in this way makes more sense, it seems to me. And I absolutely echo Jamie's points that the United Kingdom is in a position to take a lead in so many ways. And the frustration within our own armed forces, and I get this all the time at meetings that I have, is that we don't seem to be stepping up politically in bringing forward quickly enough. We're not urgently changing our force structures enough to live up to these leading roles that we're taking on. And that really is a problem. And I think Jamie's putting it very politely when he says it will advance the discussions in the UK. And here we are on the verge of a soap opera political crisis, which might just keep on going round and round in the government at the time when we need to advance those discussions.
Okay, so if we want to understand a bit more about the job we're taking on, Tim, you know JFC Norfolk intimately. What's it like as a base? What's it like as an operation? And how big a job is it that we're taking on for a British four-star?
Of the three JFCs, it's probably the biggest job, because it's the newest JFC and some of the relationships are still bedding down. So we've now, at Christmas or thereabouts, Finland and Sweden and Denmark, all of Denmark came across into Norfolk's area of responsibility, and that was announced. So you've now got this block that runs from the high north and across. The biggest point to make about Norfolk, of course, and its regional plan, so the plan that NATO has constructed, is a plan that will, in its action, defend the US. Because, of course, your adversaries, the ones that Norfolk focuses on, are coming from the high north mostly, and coming from the Arctic region. So if you can deal with them, and if you can make sure that they don't pose a threat from that area, then, of course, that explicitly defends the US. And so I used to describe it when we were writing this plan as it was a defend forward plan for the US. And the US militarily was certainly very, very comfortable with that. But it's a very small, still relatively small headquarters. The infrastructure is fine, but they're in porta cabins at the moment. Many of them, there's a couple of small buildings that they own, but it's not a fully founded thing. Anyone that's been to JFC Naples will kind of see what the gold standard of what a NATO operational Joint Force Command should look like. And Norfolk isn't there. Now, that money, that infrastructure, that investment needs to come. And it needs to come quickly, because the staff that are going to go there need to focus at getting the job done. And whilst you can make porta cabins as lovely as they are, they're one hurricane away from being not a porta cabin. And there are plans for that as well. So that in and of itself won't stop it. But it's busy. They're going to go to 450, 500, many hundreds less than the other two JFCs. When we created the jobs and the hierarchy and the structure, we were really, really focused about only needing jobs that are linked to the plan, linked to the delivery of operations. And so these will be busy people working pretty hard. And it's not the perception. There's another point you mentioned at the beginning. This isn't about cushy numbers and lots of long weekends and traveling and partying. That doesn't exist, I suggest, anywhere in the NATO command structure anymore. Those days are gone. The people that we send there work really, really hard in some quite challenging conditions, if they move their families around, all the rest of it. And we do need to focus on getting that right for our people. And at the moment, the offer isn't right.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a bit more. Jamie, I just wonder, from your time in NATO HQ, will it make a difference in terms of the job that Norfolk does and how it does it, having a Brit leading there, or actually do these NATO posts tend to be home nation neutral because people are sticking to a NATO agenda?
No, I think that obviously they're there to serve the alliance. Although it's true that nations do tend to sort of hold on to these posts like they do civilian jobs in NATO, which makes sometimes rotation very difficult indeed. For example, the UK has had the deputy SACEUR role now for several years already. Just like, throughout the command structure, Germany had Brunson for many years, although it's good now that the Germans do accept to rotate now with Poland. So rotation is a good thing. It's really, however, though, choosing countries that are able to put the resources into it. For example, I would imagine that the US now taking over MARCOM will send significantly larger numbers of people to Northwood to service that. It does help sometimes to have, obviously, Americans in command posts in Europe, SACEUR being a notable one, so that they can not only represent their nation in NATO, but more importantly, and I think this is where, James, to answer your question, it really works, represent NATO back home to their nation, particularly by testifying in Congress, as SACEUR regularly does, on what the Europeans are doing. So they have to play that political communications job as well. The other thing, though, of course, is assets, because what really counts in NATO is that when a country takes over a command position, it dedicates additional assets to that command, whether they be ships, whether they be aircraft, not just personnel, although they're very important. And I think, the key thing also is that countries that vacate these commands leave the assets there. For example, a four-star US admiral has always been in command in Naples, even a woman in recent times, which I think has been good also for NATO's visibility. The Sixth Fleet, right? So if the United States vacates that command, do the assets remain? For example, in Norfolk, it's the American Second Fleet, which was resurrected a few years back. Does that asset stay? Because that, I think, is going to be an important thing. A command is important, not because of the assets that the commander has, and it's this ability, A, for the new commander to generate assets, but for the country vacating the role to still leave those key assets there.
So, Tim, does because you were deputy commander at Norfolk, have we dedicated any assets to JFC Norfolk? And if we haven't, what might we dedicate at this point?
So every nation offers forces against the regional plan. Obviously, we're not going to talk about that on the show, but every nation is quite clear, should the regional plan be activated, what they will offer. And so I think the US Sixth Fleet is not only a Mediterranean fleet, it's in the Mediterranean, and the eastern side of the Atlantic is where its area of responsibility is, and Second Fleet is the western side of the Atlantic. And those are American national capabilities that sort of sit there. So I don't see any change to apportionment. I think for the UK, having command of JFC Norfolk, and the UK is in its area of responsibility. So we are commanding the NATO operation that would be responsible for the defense of the UK, must focus us on making sure that we can fulfill those commitments and making sure that the force elements, in all the domains and in every sense, are available even when they're needed. So going back to your point about getting on and Mike's point about getting on with changing the Navy, as the First Sea Lord, aims to do, and making sure that the Air Force and the Army are fit for purpose against the roles that the various regional plans offer.
Mike, it's easy, and certainly a lot of the commentary and reporting on this has taken this as a sign as a US pullback from NATO and Europe. Is it that simple? What's your take on this?
No, it's not in a sense a pullback. It is a tidying up, and I think we do think it's logical. On the other hand, it keeps American forces locked in. As Jamie said, it's really important that the commanders of these component commands have their American staffs with them, because that keeps Americans in the system. And again, the armed forces all get on very well. And whatever is happening at the political level, service personnel, they work together, they do think the same sort of way. They don't really reflect the political tensions way above their heads. They get on with things and they know each other. And that is invaluable when you really need force cooperation, that they've worked together for many, many years. So I think all of that is good. It's extremely important that Sakur remains an American. If Sakur were not an American, I think that really would look like a symbol of America's disengagement from the integrated military structure. But again, I come back to this question of political scenarios. One could envisage scenarios, and I think we ought really to test some of these structures against a range of political scenarios, and I think that's what a lot of think tanks may be doing. You could imagine scenarios in which the North Atlantic Council, the political decision maker, the NAC, creates slightly ambiguous orders or an ambiguous decision on an operation, and then operationally, the American forces are less coherent with the Joint Force Commands, that they come under pressure. I mean, one can imagine tensions between the component commands and the Joint Forces Command if there was ambiguity, if there's a row going on at the political level and the NAC was pushed into giving ambiguous instructions. I don't know how realistic that is, but one could imagine that there'd be a pullback of American forces in the component commands as against what the Joint Force commanders say they need. And I think we ought to test some scenarios and stress test this new structure. But on the face of it, the new structure, I think, is reassuring to the Europeans, but we still don't know, remember, whether the United States or how far the United States will draw down some of its forces in NATO. We are expecting a drawdown. We thought we'd hear in November last year. Here we are in February. We still are waiting. And when it comes, there will be some drawdown in US forces, it is expected, across European NATO.
Just briefly, I'm interested to hear from Jamie and Tim. Tim, deliberately ambiguous orders or instructions. Have you ever experienced something that seemed like it was being issued deliberately ambiguous?
I mean, I could be slightly naughty and say most instructions from the NAC and NATO headquarters are slightly ambiguous because, of course, they're a political direction versus a military order. And where Sakur comes in at shape, of course, is he then converts that into clear military orders. I have seen NATO conduct an operation where one of the big nations who had many forces that were meant to be committed in accordance with the schedule, that nation said, I don't want to participate in that operation. And that was fine. They didn't block the op. They just said, the op can happen, but we will not participate. And yet they were the framework nation for that in that moment. And so we just had to find other nations to fill the gaps. So it doesn't stop it. And the point that Mike made, the Joint Force Commands own the geography and own the operational level fight. So in peacetime, so now, today, they are directing. So we've seen Arctic Sentry was announced yesterday. Joint Force Command Norfolk will direct that activity. And that will be a continuous series of exercises and activity to demonstrate readiness and be match fit. And Mike said it, below them will sit the domains. So MARCOM, AIRCOM, LANDCOM, and the other domains will sit below the JFCs. JFC will say, I want this effect in that area at that time. And then the domains will convert that into orders to the ships. So if a nation said we're less enthused about this, we don't want to participate, or we don't want to be as forward-leaning, that happens all the time. And so the commanders will then have to say, okay, I can't use countries X as forces. We'll then now focus on using country Y or country Z. Clearly, the US has the largest military capability at the moment, and they've got some exquisite stuff that we need to make use of. But a reduction and absence of any one country is not that things don't work.
Jamie, I saw you smiling at the concept of deliberately ambiguous orders from the NAC. I mean, that's politics, isn't it?
Yes, well, yes, of course. And, I can think when I was the NATO spokesman back in the previous century, particularly, in the crises in the Balkans, of some good examples. For example, in Kosovo, one stage we took a decision to use helicopters, only then to discover that it was too dangerous to use helicopters and we had to backtrack. Or at an earlier stage in dealing with the collapse of Yugoslavia, we announced a maritime embargo in the Adriatic vis-a-vis Serbia, only to discover that there was no legal basis to do it. And again, had to backtrack. So these things do exist from time to time. I think the other thing that, the military will draw up plans, a pattern of escalation, which is normal in any kind of military operation. That's part of deterrence, and that's part of how you apply force. And I also remember during Kosovo that whereas allies were fairly happy to start phase one, which was obviously the bombing of military targets in Kosovo itself, to get Milosevic to withdraw his forces from the province, once we started to get closer to stage 4, which was hitting targets in the broader Yugoslavia, again, lots of people suddenly had hesitations there. And I think there's always going to be that sort of tension between politics and military logic in the conduct of operations. But, again, you find a way forward and you resolve it. And fortunately for us in Kosovo, we didn't have to get to stage 4. However, we're dealing now with collective defense, right? We're dealing with a response to an all-out attack. So some of those sort of political sensitivities, which would have in Afghanistan or in the Balkans or outside your territory, and you're not fighting for your existence, some of those constraints I don't think would apply so much when you really are fighting for your existential survival. Just a quick word on US disengagement, which came up a moment ago. I also am not an alarmist here because we have not seen a major drawdown of US forces from Europe. And I hear with the NATO defense ministers meeting today in Brussels from my sources that the Pentagon is not announcing any dramatic new drawdown. May come in the future, but not yet. Americans are still showing up for exercises, which is what really matters now that NATO is relying more on the US to reinforce, as opposed during the Cold War to being massively in the front line. And Congress also, I think, is now much more assertive than it was a while ago on Greenland, for example, and the new Defense Authorization Act prohibits the president, prohibits, let's see, with Donald Trump, but prohibits the president from taking any further action to draw down forces in Europe without consulting Congress first. So hopefully, we will now have a rebalancing of NATO, which probably was long overdue, rather than an American withdrawal, but hopefully an incentive for the Europeans to take more responsibility.
I could report that my own source, we all have our own private sources, which we either trust or we don't. But some of my sources are telling me that despite what Hegseth and Elbridge Colby in the Pentagon are talking about, the Pentagon in general as an institution is kind of slow rolling all of this, as they say. They're thinking about all the things they've got to check out first. So even with, very assertive leadership trying to push the Pentagon in a direction which institutionally it doesn't really want to go in, the Pentagon is not going to be disobedient, but it can slow roll the progress towards this drawdown. But I think there will be some sort of drawdown, but it may not be so significant. I don't mind if the combat units or some of the combat units are pulled out of Europe, because they can always come back in very quickly. You worry if the enablers are pulled out. That's the point. The enablers won't get back quickly. If the enablers stay and the combat units go, or some of them go, that's fine. That's symbolic. That will look good to the White House, and it won't have a big effect on NATO's effectiveness if it comes to a real crisis. The combat units can always get back.
Jamie, Tim, while we've got you here, I'd like to get your thoughts on something that was recently put to the UK's Chief of Defence Staff under questioning from MPs. The idea that if you're serving in the British Armed Forces, a NATO posting might actually be a poisoned chalice. Yes, it's great experience, it's high profile, but potentially it could be a bit of a career blocker. It was the Lib Dem MP Ian Room who raised the concern with Air Chief Marshal Sir Rich Knighton. Let's just hear from him.
What I'm picking up is sometimes when officers, serving officers or personnel are sent on NATO roles, it affects their promotion. This is what they're telling me, mainly because that another commanding officer may be from another NATO country and it doesn't fit within the structures of what the career paths are set for people in those roles, because they've already got to come back and have experience of doing that role before they consider for promotion. So if we truly NATO first, how are you as CDS going to ensure that the culture changes so that actually their time spent in NATO command positions does not affect their promotion?
Well, actually, I want to do the opposite. I want to actually enhance their promotion prospects if people have been to NATO and then brought that experience back into the UK, and that's got to be the way we do it. And people will believe it when they see it and feel it, and that's the trick. And we're working hard at the Senior Appointments Committee, and I know the Single Service Promotion Boards are working hard to ensure that those who have got that experience have opportunities to promote.
You picked it up as an issue.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Tim, I wonder what your experience is. Is this an issue of perception or an issue of reality about NATO postings being a career blocker?
I think, and I'm out of date now, but I think, and I've heard this CDS, I've heard previous chiefs talk about this, and this has been a narrative conversation for a number of years, but I saw a reality of people being told, if you go to NATO, that will impact your career, and not in a good way, in a negative way. A high-octane NATO staff officer, right at the front line against our adversaries, live operations, planning and executing joint operations or single service operations, depending on where they're based, day in, day out, and committing in an extraordinary way, will be told, yeah, you may have got an amazing OJAR or SJAR, you may have done amazingly well, but we need you to come back and basically do it again in the UK just to make sure that you're actually that good. The question from the MP was spot on, and CDS's reply is a reply I recognise because it's one that's been made for quite a while, but I had not yet seen when I left a change in behaviours. We've got to get this right. The Germans have got an interesting approach. If you want to get promoted above colonel, you have to have done a NATO tour. No discretion, no conversation as a staff officer. If you want to make OF5, if you want to make colonel captain, group captain, then you have to have done a NATO tour and you have to have been successful.
So they've flipped the script. I mean, Mike, it seems stunning given that our defence review is everything about NATO first. Surely it's a no-brainer for someone to do their job properly within the UK Armed Forces, to do it at its very best. They need experience within NATO, don't they?
Yes, and that's going to be the case in the future. The point is that you get, by and large, you get promoted for being where the war is. Officers want to go where the war is. And when the war was in Iraq and Afghanistan, everybody wanted combat experience. That was the route to promotion, whereas a NATO job was a bureaucratic job. And as Tim said, I mean, there are issues that you've got to do the bureaucratic job twice. And that was foolish. And I think everybody recognised that. This will wear off as a problem, because if you get promoted by being where the war is, believe me, the war is going to be in NATO. That's the point. We are now talking about the defence of Europe. So that's where the war is, in NATO.
Jamie, did you, in your time working in NATO HQ with senior officers from all allied nations, did you detect a varying attitude as to whether they were happy to be at NATO or enduring it?
Yeah, no, Mike, in fact, gave my answer. So we'll try just to add a couple of things briefly. First of all, it doesn't apply on the civilian side. For example, the current British ambassador to NATO, very important job in the Foreign Office, is the former Assistant Secretary General on the NATO International Staff for Defence Planning and Policy. The former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, is a former UK ambassador to NATO, etc. So I don't think on the civilian side it's at all true that people's careers have suffered by doing a stint at NATO, and on the military side, that shouldn't be the case. I think one particular problem, though, is that the UK likes the senior jobs, like any country. We mentioned Deputy SACEUR, and so these jobs tend to go to people who are naturally at the end of their career, and unless they're going to be promoted to First Sea Lord or obviously the Chief of Defence, will end their careers after that, because given the seniority money, and given that the military retire early, there's nowhere else to go. Although that doesn't stop them, as we know from desackers, becoming media moguls and pundits and writing books and so on after that, and good luck to them. But Mike's point is, I think, is the one that I wanted to make as well. As the UK now focuses very much on Europe and focuses on NATO and preparing for serious combat, then obviously NATO and sort of operational roles are becoming more fused, which should make them more interesting. The other thing too is that, as NATO also enlarges its scope, dealing more with the EU, dealing more with hybrid warfare, dealing more with resilience issues, cyber, counterterrorism, the opportunity of a British officer serving at NATO to get a range of different experience in diplomacy, in dealing some of these other issues, in how defence, fuses with these sort of civilian homeland security type of functions, should make the job a lot more rewarding, perhaps, than when it was, perhaps, like in the past, the Cold War days, strictly military planning exercise. Anyway, if that's the case, it's just as much a failure on the UK side for not taking the job seriously enough and exploiting them fully, as it would be, if you like, the fault of the NATO command structure for not taking making the jobs interesting enough. It really takes two to tango here, right?
Well, the jobs are definitely interesting enough, I'd say. And the only other point I'd make on this is we need to get the package right for the families.
Yeah,
it's hard enough moving families around the UK and the stresses we impose on our serving personnel and their families as we post them around the place. Going abroad, even into Europe, but certainly to the US or elsewhere, is a huge ask and demand, and we haven't got that right. The loss of income if you're moving your spouse and they're working, all these sorts of things have not been looked at. The US do this a lot better, within the US certainly, but actually when they move people around the US. And of course, my privilege of being in Norfolk in that time was I was able to see so many countries and how they move, all these European countries that move themselves and their families to the United States, and how they help the families settle and set them up, and then made sure they were appropriately, paid and sorted out. And I know there are changes in defense on that as well, but this thing isn't free. It is not a free proposition to move people around the planet and then just say, well, get on with it. And by the way, it's really important, and we think highly of you. You'll get that. You won't get the best people. Of course, you'll get those that are willing to move, and that's not always the same thing.
Really, really useful insights. Tim, thank you so much. Tim Henry and Jamie Shea joining us from Brussels. Thank you both. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.
Now, Mike, I saw from one of your posts on Blue Sky, the same thing caught both our eyes this week, the end of the CIA World Factbook. Now, this has been an unclassified source of intelligence, facts and figures, basically, around the world, stretching back to 1971. It is no more, though, shuttered by the US government, and you're sad to see it go.
Yes, I am. The World Factbook was a sort of big paperback, A4 size paperback usually, of a couple of hundred pages, and every page was a different country. And there were all the statistics of that country with a little note, politically neutral note about government and political parties and so on. So it was a really good rundown of the basic statistics of world politics. And it was based, of course, on CIA intelligence and what they bring together. But it was a source book, both for everybody throughout US government, but also many people around the rest of the world. And the point is, the idea was, if this is the CIA fact book, then these are reliable facts. That was what we used to think about them. And then without any explanation, the CIA said, we won't be publishing the fact book anymore. And that was very disappointing to me. I mean, my comment is the CIA stopped bothering about basic facts now, because it was a bit of soft power. The fact is that they collect all this stuff anyway, and putting it into even digital or hard copy didn't cost them very much because they've got all that information. They keep it up to date. But it gave the CIA a very good image around the world. It was soft power, and they seem to have shot themselves in the foot by ending it. Because for saving a very small amount of money, they've created the idea that their facts are not now universally acceptable.
I mean, the physical book, I think long since gone. Certainly, it's been primarily an online resource. I can remember we did a program a year or so ago about Chagos Islands, and I ended up at the CIA Factbook and found quite a lot of information unclassified that was really useful to understand. I mean, you say it won't cost much. This is an unclassified version of a classified internal tool, and actually doing that kind of sanitizing process, it costs money. We know that the new CIA director wants to focus on core mission. I also just wonder, is it in this information age, is it all out there to be found anyway elsewhere these days?
Yes, of course it is, but it will be found in more disparate ways. It won't all be consistent. I mean, anybody knows if you start to try to pull together statistical information on other countries or trade or economic statistics, there isn't usually one absolutely authoritative source. The variations can be phenomenal. And then there's the deliberate distortions that the internet is absolutely full of. So it requires quite a lot of decent research by people who've got their lights switched on to pull material together. Whereas the CIA Factbook used to be regarded as straightforward, authoritative, a bit like the military balance that the IISS produces, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Now, lots of people disagree with this or that in the military balance, but it's the basic. If you start with the military balance, you might argue with different aspects of what it says about particular countries, but everybody accepts that is a well-intentioned, politically neutral version of what the baseline stats really are. Yeah. And that was the CIA World Factbook. So the fact that it's not now available, I think just takes away from the world a good source, a starting point for common statistical and informational analysis. And it just throws it open again to all the charlatans and all the slop creators on the internet. And of course, if you rely on AI, as Dame Wendy Hall says, who's one of the best in Britain on this, she said AI is getting more dumb every day. Because, if AI looks at a discrete data source, like you say health records, then it's absolutely phenomenal. Because, health records are basically accurate and AI can tell you things about them you wouldn't have believed. That's great. But if AI is just trawling the whole internet to find some facts or figures about something, then it's trawling more and more junk. And every day the internet is filling up with more junk and more slop. So AI, in its general sense, is getting stupider every day. And so if you rely on AI for your facts, then you'll get them all wrong.
There was quite a nostalgic post actually on the CIA website announcing the closure. And they gave us one last gem. It says, finally, only CIA insiders would know that officers donated some of their personal travel photographs to the World Factbook, hosted more than 5,000 photographs that were copyright free for anyone to access and use. It's got a personal connection now, isn't it, for anybody who's been looking at that World Factbook to realise that some of the photos you've been looking at were taken by CIA spies.
Yes, I have to say I didn't know that. That's very interesting. I can see the attraction using things that are copyright free, and then because if it's a CIA book, then they're free to put anything in there. And I assumed it was all carefully monitored, so the photographs didn't give anything away. But no, that's an interesting little snippet, and that's something else that we've lost then with the end of the CIA Factbook. Yeah.
Now we know why there's no name credits for the photographers. Right, I need to let you go shortly. You have packing to do, so do I. We are both off to the Munich Security Conference this weekend with the Sitrep team. I mean, last year was an absolute barnstorm. We had Vice President J.D. Vance, the US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, reading the Riot Act to Europe and demanding Ukraine does a peace deal. I note, however, this year, the US Defense Secretary, or Secretary of War, as he prefers to be called, isn't even going to be there, Mike. It's perhaps going to be a quieter one.
I'm not sure about that, because the US are sending a big delegation, reportedly, and I think the discussions we will be having, or will be party to, I think will be an extension of what was said last year. I mean, NATO has had a year to digest that sort of onslaught that it got from the key figures last year. So I don't think it will be particularly quiet, but we'll see. I mean, I guess because everyone will take a deep breath before they get there, maybe it won't be quite as sparky as last year's, but I think it will be just as important for NATO's future.
Okay, I will brace myself. I mean, you've been many times before to the Munich Security Conference. I haven't. Lots of NATO summits I've been to. Should I expect it to be like that or a bit different?
Well, I think it'd be a bit different. It's gone like Davos. I mean, years ago, it was a much more specialised conference, even though there were still some pretty important things said at them. But in recent years, they've become a sort of a grand circus. So, lots and lots of side meetings and lots of pressure groups who want to get their stories out and so on. All the think tanks will be there. And then there's the plenary sessions themselves. So the media picks up on the main plenary sessions, which looks like a standard conference, but it's surrounded by a sort of security circus. But if you think about it, last year's was pretty dramatic. I mean, I think back to the one in 2003, just before the Iraq War, when Joschka Fischer, the German minister, simply stood up at the Munich Security Conference and said to the United States, "We are not with you on this. Europe is not with you on this." And that was pretty dramatic. And then 2007, famously, Putin turned up at the Munich Security Conference and was very angry at the way NATO was enlarging and proposed to enlarge further, and warned NATO that Russia would not put up with this. And people listened but didn't take it particularly seriously. And then the following year, of course, was the war, made war on Georgia. So, the conference now and again has speeches that go into the historical record as key moments, key speeches. And then last year's will certainly go down as a key speech. We may not hear a really key speech this year, but I think this year will go down as the year of real soul searching in NATO.
Well, Mike and I will be there along with Simon Newton because Mike and Simon will be hosting a special edition of the BFBS Sitrep podcast on Sunday, explaining all about what has happened over the 3 days. They will be joined by Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commander US Army Europe, Wanon Jescu, who worked at the top of NATO from 2010 to 2023. Mike, any predictions about what you and Simon are likely to be talking about on Sunday?
I think we'll be talking about the US commitment to NATO, the transatlantic relationship, and we will certainly be talking about the Ukraine war, because the Ukraine war is still the anvil upon which the future of NATO is going to be hammered out, for good or bad.
We will look forward to it. Thank you, Mike. Thank you to all of our guests. So don't forget that special edition of Sitrep with Mike and Simon from Sunday afternoon on the Forces News YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Kate Jabot will be back with Professor Michael Clarke here for another Sitrep as usual next Thursday. For now, though, from me, James Hirst, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.